Happy Black History Month, and welcome to part two of the history of Black home ownership in the United States. In my previous video, I talked about the history of Black home ownership from the 1870s leading up to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And in this video, I will be diving into what happened after the Civil Rights Movement to Black home ownership in the United States. So, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. It was a big culmination of all of the work of civil rights leaders who were fighting for housing equality during the civil rights movement. The Fair Housing Act made it illegal to discriminate against somebody based on their race, religion, or disability status when it came to things like selling a home, financing a home, or renting a home. And while this was a big accomplishment when it came to the legal barriers facing Black Americans when it came to homeownership, it didn't solve all of the problems. Discrimination still persisted. Even though not all discrimination was punished legally, discrimination still happened in a more covert way, and Black Americans still faced barriers when it came to buying a home, renting a home, and getting financing for their homes. But at the same time, the Black home ownership rate was increasing, and this was largely due to the increase in the housing supply that occurred during this time. It happened with white families leaving the urban core to go live in newly built houses in the suburbs. And housing became more accessible because of just the increase in the supply of housing that was happening. This was also a time when Black incomes were increasing. The civil rights movement had this big victory for housing, but it also had victories when it came to labor. Black Americans were increasingly getting well paid jobs in the government sector, and there were more Black doctors, Black lawyers, and Black professionals. And this increase in the Black professional class, the Black middle class, led to more home ownership for Black Americans. Black Americans increasingly could afford to buy homes, and that led to increases in the Black home ownership rate. In addition to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there was also Section 235 that was passed. And this increased credit access and mortgage financing for more low income buyers, which applied to many Black buyers in America. But unfortunately, this program did not work perfectly in practice. Real estate speculators exploited this program. They bought dilapidated properties in segregated areas and they performed some cosmetic repairs, flipped the homes, and then sold them at inflated prices to Black families with these government backed loans. So, unfortunately, the beneficiaries of this loan program were not always the intended people. Sometimes they were real estate speculators taking advantage of government subsidization of homeownership. In the 1970s, interest rates increased due to stagflation. Stagflation is an economic phenomenon where inflation is going up at the same time that unemployment is rising. And it's really bad for the economy because it is more expensive to borrow for something like buying a home, and it's harder to find a job. So, as mortgage rates climbed during this period, it became harder for first time home buyers, including Black first time home buyers, to afford homeownership. In 1977, the Community Reinvestment Act was passed, and this was the final nail in the coffin for redlining. It required banks to meet the credit needs of an entire community, including low income and moderate income buyers. And this allowed credit access to expand in Black neighborhoods and for Black middle class homebuyers. Up until the 1980s, the gap between the white homeownership rate and the Black homeownership rate was narrowing. But starting in the 1980s, it started to expand again. And this was largely due to economic reasons. This was during a period of deindustrialization. Many jobs were going away in manufacturing hubs like Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, and many good paying jobs for Black Americans were starting to disappear. And this impacted their ability to buy homes. If you don't have a good paying job anymore, you are going to be unlikely to be able to afford home ownership. The homeownership rate for Black Americans during this time declined slightly, but some Black Americans were still able to afford homes. This was a time when we started to see more affluent Black suburbs pop up, like Prince George's County and parts of Atlanta and Houston saw increases in the Black middle class, and Black upper middle class neighborhoods began to emerge. But even in the 1980s, even though we had the Fair Housing Act in place, discrimination was still prevalent. And this brings me to a personal story. When my mother and father were buying a home in the 1980s, they tried to buy a home in what was a predominantly white neighborhood. And the white homeowner that they were trying to buy from, once she realized that my dad was Black, delisted the home just so that she could avoid selling her home to a Black man. My mother asked my dad, like, should they sue? My dad is a lawyer, and my dad simply replied that if he sued everybody who discriminated against him, he would never leave the courthouse. So, this is just an example of how, even though it was illegal to discriminate against a Black person when it came to buying a home, that discrimination still persisted. Not every case of discrimination made it to the courthouse, and this kind of covert discrimination still prevented Black Americans from becoming homeowners even into the 1980s. In recognition of stagnating home ownership rates for both white America and Black America, there was a big push to increase home ownership access starting in the 1990s. This growth was largely fueled by the expansion of credit access. Those subprime loans that we've all heard of because of the great foreclosure crisis, those were becoming more and more common in the 1990s and early 2000s. The original intent of the subprime loan was to increase credit access for more first-time home buyers. First-time home buyers who maybe didn't have a strong credit history or a strong income history were allowed to get mortgages at elevated mortgage rates. But along with this increase in credit availability came more predatory lending. The mortgage industry wanted more profits and they wanted to be able to expand to more customers, and they did so in ways that would now be considered unscrupulous. Middle income and low income homebuyers were sold on mortgage products that weren't going to be beneficial to them in the long run. They came with these elevated mortgage rates, and it meant that they would not be able to gain as much equity as quickly, and that they would be at risk of losing their homes if home values ever turned down. But during the 1990s and during the early 2000s in particular, there was this belief that home values always went up. So it didn't matter so much if you lent a mortgage to somebody with a low income or with a bad credit history, because if the home value kept going up, they would still come out ahead. Worst case scenario was that they would sell the home, they would be able to get the equity out of the home and get out of the mortgage if they ever couldn't pay their mortgage. But in 2005, the housing bubble began to burst. In 2005, home values started to decline, and in 2006, we saw the beginning of the foreclosure crisis. As home values started to come down at the same time that mortgage rates were increasing, more and more homeowners were unable to pay their mortgages. Now, it wasn't just that home values were going down or that mortgage rates were increasing. From an individual perspective, it was more of a personal catastrophe that put them into foreclosure. They might have lost their job or had some kind of medical emergency. This was before healthcare was more widely available. And just one big unforeseen expense could put them in jeopardy of being delinquent on their mortgage. And because home values were going down in 2006, it became increasingly difficult for homeowners to get out of their mortgage if they became delinquent on their mortgage. When home values were going up, they could just sell at a price that was worth more than what they owed on their mortgage and get out of it. The bank would be happy, they would walk away with money, it was no problem. But as home values started to decline, there were more short sales. A short sale is when you sell your home for less than what you owe on your mortgage, and this is when we see foreclosures start to happen. And this was the beginning of the foreclosure crisis, which set off the Great Recession. In 2004, right before the foreclosure crisis began, that was when Black home ownership reached its all time high. And it reached its all time high because of that increase in credit access. But it just goes to show that in order to increase home ownership and increase housing stability, you can't simply increase credit access and access to mortgages. You have to fundamentally solve the problem of home prices being too high. During the early 2000s, all of that increase in credit access led to more demand for homes, and that increased demand for homes sent home values higher and higher. When demand increases, prices go up. But because the people who actually were holding those mortgages were not in secure positions financially, once home values went down, everything fell apart, and that's how we got the foreclosure crisis. And following the foreclosure crisis, we saw rapid declines in the Black home ownership rate. The home ownership rate declined from 2004 all the way until 2019. It went from 49% in 2004 to just 41% in 2019. Now, during the pandemic in 2020, mortgage rates fell to record lows, and this allowed many first time buyers to enter the market of all races, including Black Americans. And the homeownership rate for Black Americans increased from 41% in 2019 to 47% in 2020. In the most recent year, 2025, the Black homeownership rate has fallen down to just 44%. So it looks like we may be continuing this 2010 trend of the Black homeownership rate declining. And the reason the home ownership rate for Black Americans is declining, and for young people and for first time home buyers just in general, is because housing has gotten so expensive. We built fewer homes in the 2010s than in any decade going all the way back to the 1960s. And with fewer homes available, there are fewer opportunities for first time home buyers to enter into the housing market. More recently, starting around 2023, mortgage rates started to increase again. And this is especially a burden for first time home buyers who are often borrowing more money to buy homes. Existing homeowners are able to take the equity from the first home that they owned and are selling and use it to buy their next home and avoid borrowing as much money when interest rates are high. But for first time home buyers, they have to borrow more. They are relying more on low down payment options and they have to take on more interest. So when interest rates are high, it hurts first time home buyers even more. So the lesson I think we can learn from this modern era of Black home ownership in the United States is that if we want to increase access to home ownership, we can't just do it by increasing access to mortgages or by subsidizing demand. We really need to focus on the supply side. We saw the biggest gains in the home ownership rate for Black Americans when we were building lots and lots of homes. So we should be increasing the supply of homes, especially the supply of homes in places that have access to good jobs. If we want to increase economic prosperity, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans, we need to make sure that people who don't necessarily come from a legacy of homeownership can still buy a home in the places that they want to live, in the places where there are high paying jobs and economic opportunities for them and their children. It is a shame that there is a scarcity of housing in the places that have the highest paying jobs. Think Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, New York City. All of these places are facing housing affordability crises. Whether or not Black Americans can access home ownership speaks volumes about whether or not people who start at the bottom of the economic ladder can climb their way to the top. So we need to enact policies that prioritize building lots of housing, dense, affordable housing in the places that have the highest economic opportunities. I'm Daryl Fairweather, Redfin's chief economist. If you'd like to learn more about the housing market and the economy, follow for more.